Hi guys, I unfortunately recorded the first section of this video on mute earlier today, so I'm re-recording it and I will be splicing lots of pieces together. I've been recording in bits and pieces today, so hopefully the audio isn't too annoying because it will possibly be different conditions and volume. Anyway, I'm going to jump straight in because today we are talking about the lost tip narrative again. This is the thread that we've been on this week, a pretty big thread, and I'm going to actually really go through the testimony of Kathy Shank with a fine-tooth comb to see if we can reconcile and make sense of this 2019 printout that we've been talking about for the last several days. So in going through the testimony, as I have already today, twice actually, yeah, I absolutely can't reconcile it, but yeah, see what you think. Let's read through it. I'm not going to read every single line of the testimony. There's stuff that's small talk and, not super relevant to what we're talking about, but I'm going to go through the key lines. You can read along. I've got it on the screen. I'll try not to scroll too fast so that you can keep up if you need to or would like to read along with it. Okay. I struggle with reading the testimony, guys, because it's lengthy, it's wordy at times, and that's not just Kathy Shank's, it's any of them. I don't know if that's to do with how my brain works, but I think I'd really struggle being on a jury listening to all of this because there's interruptions with legal arguments and, wordiness and questions and answers. Anyway, let's dive right in and let's look at Kathy Shank. So we're going to start with the direct examination of Kathy. This is the part that I recorded earlier and lost. The cross-examination part is ready to go. So let's get started. So I'm going to already scroll right down past a lot of this stuff. This is just the background information. There's a bit of talk around the building that she was in. And we're going to get to the boxes of data that she starts filing. So let's go down. So yeah, the first part of the testimony is not super relevant. She's just talking about how she helped sort of doing more administrative reception duties, directing detectives to people coming in who were giving information. But it gets interesting once she receives these boxes of paperwork, essentially, that she is to organise. Okay, so just going down a little bit. Okay, so we're going to start at line 18, which is on page 146 of volume 13 of the transcript. And this is the point where Dina asks about... No, we're actually going to start... We're going to start at line 14 of the direct examination of Kathy Shank, volume 13, page 146. If you want to follow on at home, it is on the screen, or if you want to go to the direct source. So we've got here, Dina says, okay, and you indicate that you've been assisting on a volunteer basis since March of 2017 until now. Was there you took on more responsibility, given more responsibility? And Kathy Shank says, yes, there was. And Dina says, and who was it that decided they would give you additional duties? Shank says, at this point, I can't exactly remember who decided to give me the special duties, but as I was given the responsibility of numerous bankers' boxes full of investigative reports, and I'm an organiser, so they decided possibly I could arrange these in a way that would be easily accessible to the detectives. And so at that point, I asked one of the detectives, could you please get me filing cabinets? Which they did. I sat down at the card table and at that time was asked to put these reports or narrative summaries into file folders, labeling them with the name of what we call person of interest. And Dina says the name that you would put on the folder could be a witness, could be a person of interest. Did you have any idea? And Shank says, I had no idea. I was just looking at names. At that time, I was directed not to get into exactly the report narrative, but just look at a name and place it on file folder. So here we're not reading what's actually in the folder or in the narrative. We're just reading the names and putting them in the folder. Okay, so that's my word. Sorry, guys, not her testimony. So just pointing out there, though, that at this stage, all she's doing is marrying up names, putting them on the names onto the folders. Okay. So Dina then says, and were you doing this? You said at a card table. Was this in the REMC building? Now, they talk a lot about which building they're in, and I'm not sure the relevance of that, but yeah. So Dina says, and do you know how many file folders you created? And Shank says 5 filing cabinets jam-packed full. We'll go down a little bit further because we don't really need to know the specifics of the filing cabinets. And Dina says, now when you created these folders, did the tab on the folder just have a first and last name? And Shank says, sometimes a middle name, but yes. And Dina says, okay, and was there anything else you were directed to do in creating those folders? So it sort of sounds like what happened was there were these boxes of paperwork, and Shank's role was to basically collate those papers into folders with names on them. So, for example, if there were 2 sheets of paper that said Sally Smith, obviously no such person, I don't believe, involved in this case, just a random name I'm making up, then she would get a folder, put it in, and label it Sally Smith. So I think that was the organization, so that it wasn't just random loose sheets in a box. So anyway, she says that she was not directed to do anything else at that time. So basically, her job was to look through the paperwork for the name only, not read the entirety of the document, and file things in folders and write the names on them. Now, that would mean then that there'd be no reason to be going and printing off or creating any other documents. At this point, it would just be working with the material in those boxes. Okay, guys, I might see if I can reload it so that it's not so blurry. Give me a sec. Okay, guys, I'm going to start it again from that point, but let me know if it looks any different. Referring to entering information into the data. So now we've got a second person, Carol, who's also, it says the name that you would put on the folder could be a witness, could be a person of interest. Now I have no idea where we were up to, guys. Sorry. I'm going to just zoom back a little bit, and if there's a repetition, sorry, guys. Did you have any idea? And Shank says, I had no idea. I was just looking at names. At that time, I was directed not to get into exactly the report narrative, but just look at a name and place it on file folder. So here we're not reading what's actually in the folder or in the narrative. We're just reading the names and putting them in the folder. Okay, so that's my word. Sorry, guys, not her testimony. So just pointing out there, though, that at this stage, all she's doing is marrying up names, putting them on the names onto the folders. Okay. So Dina then says, and were you doing this? You said at a card table. Was this in the REMC building? Now, they talk a lot about which building they're in, and I'm not sure the relevance of that, but yeah. So Dina Dina says, and do you know how many file folders you created? And Shank says 5 filing cabinets jam-packed full. We'll go down a little bit further because we don't really need to know the specifics of the filing cabinets. And Dina says, now when you created these folders, did the tab on the folder just have a first and last name? And Shank says, sometimes a middle name, but yes. And Dina says, okay, and was there anything else you were directed to do in creating those folders? So it sort of sounds like what happened was there were these boxes of paperwork, and Shank's role was to basically collate those papers into folders with names on them. So, for example, if there were 2 sheets of paper that said Sally Smith, obviously no such person, I don't believe, involved in this case, just a random name I'm making up, then she would get a folder, put it in, and label it Sally Smith. So I think that was the organization, so that it wasn't just random loose sheets in a box. So anyway, she says that she was not directed to do anything else at that time. So basically, her job was to look through the paperwork for the name only, not read the entirety of the document, and file things in folders and write the names on them. Now, that would mean then that there'd be no reason to be going and printing off or creating any other documents. At this point, it would just be working with the material in those boxes. So Dina just, again, clarifies that, okay, and so were you the only one making the folders? Oh, that's right. And this is when Shank says no, a former colleague of hers was also vetted and to be able to put the names on the folders. But again, we were both instructed not to read the reports, just to put the names on the file folders. So now we've got a second person, Carol, who's also going through the paperwork and putting names on folders, which could explain why there's a variety of different handwriting samples. If we look at these exhibits, I wonder whose handwriting it is that has written Richard Allen and Richard Allen Whiteman, whose handwriting has written potentially some of the other handwritten notes that we're seeing on this exhibit. Because my theory is those notes were written later than 2017 and potentially by one of these ladies or somebody else later down the track. All speculation, of course. We're going to go down a little bit because they're just verifying that Carol was following the same process, and it seems like the prosecution here are really trying to highlight the fact that these ladies were not looking at the contents of the reports and paperwork, which I think was their aim to say there's no way that these ladies saw this information earlier. But it's actually quite problematic now in light of the fact that we have this printout of Rick's narrative in 2019, because they're insisting that they didn't look at any of the details, and yet Kathy Shank is logged into Orion printing out 1 page of 1 on investigative thread 74, which is Richard Allen, in 2019. So doesn't make sense, right? Okay, so I'm going to go down a bit because some of this stuff isn't really super important. So it says, Dina says, and that meant the banker's boxes that were brought to you full of narrative reports or lead sheets were put in folders. Kathy Shank says, yes, ma'am. And Dina says, then did you take on additional responsibility? And Kathy says, yes. And what was the additional responsibility, Dina asks. I was requested to enter narrative summaries that had been completed by various officers into a database. And Dina says, and how did you receive these narrative summaries? Shank, the narrative summaries were many times already, they were in the reports, and I was looking to put whatever narrative summary in there in that report at that time. And Dina says, and what were you doing that did it further organize the information by putting it into the database? And Shank says the database required a covered lead section, and I was wanting to complete those sections, and that's what I was doing. So here, Shank is referring to entering information into the database, which we later find out is Orion, not printing things off the database. So again, this does not help us to make sense of why she's printed Richard Allen's narrative, which seems to have been has been entered in 2017 by Dan Doolan and or the person who is acting on his behalf. There are a number of names on that sheet. You can have a look yourself. I've talked about that previously. So we're not seeing anywhere any mention of Kathy Shank needing to go and find narratives off Orion and print them off. What we're hearing is that she has reports and she's entering sometimes narratives into Orion. She's consolidating the database, not consolidating the paper files with things off the database. The whole purpose of this exercise is to organize the information and eventually, as we'll find as we go through this testimony, to scan any of the paperwork onto the online database or the digital database so that everything is contained on that database. So if she's not here to be creating more paperwork, she's here to organize the paperwork that is there and then to scan it in. So let's go down a little bit later. So we've got Dina saying, okay, when a lead comes in, how is it distinguished from another lead or in your database? And Shank says it was distinguished by a numbering system. Dina says, okay, so did each lead get a number assigned to it? And Kathy Shank says, yes, it did. And that was done with the database. Yes. Was this database used for cases outside of the Abby and Libby investigation? Kathy Shank says absolutely not. And so you said you would enter narrative summaries into this database. Kathy Shank says yes. Did you enter anything else into the database? And Shank says, once I began doing that, and we'd moved from REMC to the city building here in Delphi, I was asked to begin entering tips into the database. So they talk a little bit about the different movement between buildings. That probably would help us with kind of anchoring time points. So if anybody does know when these moves occurred from the REMC to the city building, and then I think they move again later, that would be really helpful. Please put it in the comments below if you do have an idea of what those timeframes were. So Dina says, did you have to be given special access to receive the tips? And Shank says, they were forwarded to me and then I entered them initially. And Dina says, and how were they forwarded to you? And Shank says, through, I believe, now Sheriff Tony Liggett was receiving those. There were several officers receiving them. And now Sheriff Liggett stated, Kathy, you can do this, no problem. And showed me how to do it, taught me how to do that. And I began entering those tips into the database. And then eventually they were forward. I was part of the Abby and Libby referral line, so they could just come directly to me through the tip line. And this just continues. They were received through email. And Dina talks again about the move. So she says, at this point, you've moved from the REMC building to the city building. Is that correct? And at that point, you're entering information into the computer database. And Shank says, correct. And Dina says, who would you go to with questions or to get directions? And she talks about unified command, Tony Liggett particularly. And let's go down a little bit further. So Dina says, did you notice that they were at this point, there were less law enforcement? So they talk about that a little bit further. Again, going to just skim through some of this. So Dina says, what happened to your file cabinet once you started entering these things into the computer? Where was it? And Kathy Shank says it moved with her to the city building and it still exists today. So Dina says at that time, when you received information, did you receive it and put it only into the computer database, or was it also put in a file cabinet in a folder? And interesting here, Shank says, when I received the tip information, it went into the database. So interesting again, because this is showing that this wasn't a mission of generating more paper data. It was about consolidating a database. So Dina says, okay, and were you then asked to do something more with the file cabinet information? And Shank says, yes. And Dina says, do you remember when that was? So here, Shank says this was approximately around September of 2020. So Dina then asks, what did you do with the file cabinet information? And Shank says, I was asked then to begin scanning the information from each file into the database. So again, we see that It seems the aim of this whole mission is to organize paperwork information in those boxes into files and then to scan those files and to consolidate this online or this digital database system. And so clearly that was the goal of this whole mission, not to go on that database and print information. Again, this is why I believe that the printing of the information on Rick Allen in 2019 was more likely part of the investigative process as opposed to this organizing system. And as I am going to continue to restate over and over again, I wonder if it was to do with kind of corroborating the geofence data and not necessarily directly looking at Rick, but looking at anyone who was on the trails that day while they were doing the cast analysis, looking at the geofence data and kind of trying to determine whose phone was who so that they could isolate phones of concern. And so, yeah, I wonder if that's why it was being printed in 2019. It was being printed to provide the phone information for Rick to the ISP, because the 2017 printout, which probably was in this box or could have been in this box, would have only entailed the initial tip. It didn't have the full narrative with the phone information. And that's why I believe someone subsequently then printed that off, put it together with the 2017 sheet and written that the information around the phone was passed on to ISP and that there was nothing new here. And then again, somebody has subsequently written cleared or previously had written cleared. Who knows? But there's two lots of writing on there. And I really think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's go down here. So Dina says, and so at that time you were creating a duplicate of your file cabinet, file system in the computer. And Kathy says, yes, the tips obviously in there that I had access to but there were other documents within the file folders that needed to be scanned into that database. So I would imagine this might be corroborative information, maybe something like what we saw Yellow Jacket posted on Twitter, the supplementary information. Although no, that looked like it had come from the database, but potentially if there were like corroborating phone records or written statements or whatever that they could kind of enter into the system. So then she kind of goes through how long it took her, about 2 years. And they say, where was she working on this? So this was at the city building. And then she talks about at some point they needed rooms in the city building and they had to find another location and they moved again. And again, the filing cabinets moved with Shank. Okay, so let's go further down now. Okay, so we're getting to the important part now. So we've got here Dina on line 10 saying, now after you finished the filing cabinet scans, were you working on something that led to the attention being brought to Richard Allen? And Kathy says, yes, I was. And Dina says, and can you explain what you were doing that led to that? And this is when Shank says, yes. When we moved from the city building to our current location, I had brought with me materials that I had not yet gone through to determine exactly what they were and where they needed to go, whether it needed to be filed, whether it needed to go to other detectives for review. As I was doing that, I had located a box, which what I would call would be like a file folder box that I'd placed in my desk drawer for further perusal when I had finished scanning. And I began going through that box, and when I noticed that basically I was observing handwritten tip numbers. And my concern was that these tip numbers needed to coordinate with tip numbers that had previously been entered into the system prior to me. I hadn't done any handwritten tip numbers. Mine were all directly from the AWLG tip line, and I entered them directly into the database. So these were written out prior to me. I didn't know by whom or when, and I wanted to ensure that they would coordinate because I didn't want to miss any tips that had been entered in case there would be an important tip that needed to be reviewed. And as I went through that box, that's when I found a lead sheet. Okay, first of all, this sounds like the Too Hard Basket Now, she's only coming back to this 2 years later. If it was super relevant, I'm not sure why it would have been left for 2 years. Secondly, I don't even really know what she's talking about with the handwritten numbers, because I would assume that those handwritten numbers correlate with what's on the database. They're not just a completely randomly generated number system, but maybe I'm incorrectly interpreting what's being said here. Anyway, let's go down. So she came across this lead sheet. And so at this point, this is what Dina says, your role had changed, I would say, significantly from when you started as a receptionist. Is that correct? And Shank says, yes, it did. And Dina says, and at this point in the investigation, because you were maybe brought into the fold a little bit by doing the tasks with the documents, you had more information about just general facts. Would that be true? And Shank says, yes, that's correct. And so Dina says, and so when you come across a particular lead sheet, what was it that caught your attention? And here, Shank says, the lead sheet stated that I believe it was February the 16th is when it was entered, that a Richard Allen Whiteman had self-reported being out on the trails between the hours of 1:30 and 3:30 and had seen 3 girls. And so why did that catch your attention at this point? Dina asks. And Shank says, I'd previously read that a young girl on February the 13th of 2017 had been on the trails and had seen a man at that approximate time and place, and that he had self-reported earlier. So my concern here is that how is she aware of the young girl and her statement from February the 13th of 2017, first of all? And if she is aware of it, was she not aware of that previously too? I don't know how much was known in the town around timeframes and who saw what, but I would assume perhaps actually she already knew that because word would have spread. But if not, then she means that she's actually read the statement of this young girl. And what would be the reason she'd read that statement? Because she wasn't meant to be reading the files, right? Anyway, so either way, it could be, it could be explained by the fact that she knew this information, in which case she would have known it back earlier on when she was initially filing these items. But if not, if this was not widely known, then that means she was reading information from witnesses, which I believe was not meant to be happening. And that's the whole explanation for why she didn't see this lead sheet earlier. So Dina then says, and so why was this a particular concern to you when you read the Richard Allen Whiteman self-report? And she says, to me, it seemed like a possible correlation. Obviously, I wasn't privy to a lot of information, but it just seemed like there could be a correlation, enough to cause me to take that concern to a filing cabinet, which would have been labeled Richard Allen Whiteman. And I pulled that file, and that's how I put it together. So basically, this lead sheet is not part of the folder. This lead sheet was found in this 2 hard basket box that she had, that she was then perusing after she'd done all of the other organizing and scanning. And then she goes to the actual file that she clearly worked on earlier and put in the filing cabinet. Now, the lead sheet would be the very same sheet that is in the folder, and that says cleared on it. So again, when she picked that up from her 2 hard basket, first of all, why had it been put in there? Because it's already been filed. And secondly, why wasn't she still thinking it was cleared then? Because it says quite clearly on it, it's got a strike through it and it says cleared. And it says phone info sent to ISP or whatever. So guys, this is the sheet I think she's referring to. Just reminding you guys, that's the sheet. So this is what she found in her 2 hard basket. And suddenly it dawned on her that this was important, this little bit of text here. And she went back to the folders that she had arranged herself. And that's where she found this and that other page that was printed in 2019 when she must have been in some sort of dissociative state and realized it was important back then too. Okay, back to the presentation. Catch her interest. So Dina then says, so the tip you had in your hand from the box of miscellaneous documents you were checking on, you then compared to the filing cabinet file. Is that correct? And Shank says, yes, that's correct. And is there some significance to the fact that the box was from a tip that came in February of 2017 with relationship to the work you were doing? And Shank says, I honestly don't know how that lead ended up in the box. I don't know. And Tina says, well, you were helping with the case in February of 2017. And here, a bit confusing because Shank says, I was, but she obviously wasn't. She was working in the case from March. But anyway, she said, I was helping with it, but I don't know how the exact lead sheet became in that box. I had filed, obviously, a lead and the narrative I found at some point way back in 2017. So she says, I had filed a lead and the narrative I found at some point way back in 2017. But the narrative was printed in 2019. Does make sense. And she said, but I certainly hadn't remembered it by that time. But you remembered it 2 years later and decided to print the narrative then. So it doesn't make sense, does it, guys? Okay. So we go on and we clarify the fact that she wasn't working there in February. It was March. Let's go down a bit further. So basically, Dina asked, were there other things in that miscellaneous box? And she said, I assume so, because these handwritten tip numbers would have been done prior to her knowledge of that. Again, don't really understand the point of the handwritten lead numbers. Wouldn't they be still connected to the Orion digital numbers? They wouldn't be different. Dina says, and so it's your understanding then that the handwritten tip lead numbers existed before the database you were using. And Shank says, I assume so, or they were writing them in conjunction with, but I don't know that for sure. Well, my understanding is the database is Orion, and this comes up later in the cross-examination. So Dina says you don't know that, and I'm going to stop there because I believe this is where it transfers over to where I recorded with sound earlier today. So let's transition back to that. We've got Dina asking, you don't know that. Okay, so you go to the file and it's labeled Richard Allen Whiteman with Whiteman as the last name. And Shank says correct. And when you go to the file folder, do you find something that then increased your attention to this tip? And Shank says, yes, I did. Dina says, and what was that? Shank says, there had been a narrative summary entered in the database prior to me. It was entered in February and stating that Richard Allen had been interviewed and lived on Whiteman Drive. Dina, so did that information coincide with the tip number for Richard Allen Whiteman? Shank, yes, it did. Dina, and at that time, it was put in that folder. Were you reading the content of the tips or the narratives? And Shank says, no, I was just labeling them. Just labeling them? But you clearly didn't just label it because you printed it in 2019. Let's go back to this. So Dina says, and was there something about the tip that related to you never going back to that particular file until this time? And Shank says, I had no reason to. It had cleared. Oh, she actually says, I had cleared. Interesting. Is that a Freudian slip, guys? I had cleared. The tip narrative or lead narrative, as I call it, that I found had the word cleared on it. And I developed a system of coding those files who were cleared by a green mark on the file. And this had a green mark, and that's why. Okay, so here we go again. So she was just labeling them. She says that here in line 20. And then she's asked by Dina, was there something about the tip that related to you never going back to that particular file until this time? So she labeled it and she never went back to it until this particular time. And she says because she had no reason to. But you did. You went back to it in 2019. Now, not only did she go back to it, but she printed that narrative in 2019. I feel like they'll say here, though, that she printed it and didn't look at it. But again, it doesn't make sense. Why did she look up that one specific tip and print it in 2019? So we've got here, Dina asks, and so it was not your job to decide if something was cleared. Is that correct? And And I think that's because she said here, earlier up here, I had cleared. And I think Dina's making sure that that isn't misunderstood. So Shank says, oh, no, not at all. And Dina says, and it wasn't your job to decide who followed up on a tip. Is that correct? And Shank says, no, not at all. And Dina says, organising the information, would that be fair? And Shank says, that's fair. And then Dina says, what did you do with the documents that you found? And Shank says, I believe Tony was a chief deputy at that time, one of our directors, Tony Liggett, and Tony and I happened to be at the centre when I found this. And I took this information to Tony to have him look at it. And Dina says, okay, at that point, did you make any changes to your file folder with regard to the name and where it was placed in the file cabinet? And she says, no, not on that day, but later I did. Well, this is interesting because as I showed you in yesterday's live, Yellow Jacket had posted a supplementary print off from Orion that suggests that Kathy Shank was changing the name, or that the name changed earlier in 2022. I believe it may be May. I'm not sure the exact date, but we can have a look back at that and you'll be able to see that. So she says, I changed it to Richard Allen. And so then it became filed in the A's, Dina says. And Shank says, well, it wasn't ever filed back in the filing cabinet. It was given to Tony Liggett at that time. And we've got here, what day did you make that discovery? And Shank says it was on September the 21st of 2022. She remembers that day because it's her deceased husband's birthday. Okay, I'm going to pause for a minute and get to the next relevant section because there's more to go through. Give me 1 second. Okay. It was actually just right next to it. So Dina says, Kathy, I'm going to show you what's marked as States Exhibit 228. Sorry, my dog has decided to join us and he's just done a little burp, I think. Have you heard that? Sorry, guys. So she says, Kathy, I'm going to show you what's marked as States Exhibit 228. It has 3 pages. Please look at all of them. Do you recognise those documents? Now, States Exhibit 228, guys, you remember it's a manila folder with the label on it. It is a 2017 printout that has the cleared on it, and it is a 2019 printout that has the tip narrative on it. So she says that accurately reflects the manila file folder that she created and the notes on the file folder in the tab area. And then Dina says, and does it also accurately reflect the 2 pages that you found in the physical folder when you went to look for it on September 22nd, 21st it is actually. They correct that in a minute, of 2022. Now, those 2 pages are what she found in the folder. What did she find in the box? I don't really understand this. I'm not sure what was found in the box versus the folder.
So, guys, because I recorded part 1 after I recorded part 2, because I'd initially recorded it without the microphone on, the thing that she found in the miscellaneous box, the too hard basket, was indeed this page. Oops, there we go. Apparently, according to what she said. So she found this page in the box. She also found this page and the other 2019 printed page when she went to look in the file. So, yeah, just clearing that up now.
Confusing, right? If anyone knows, again, comment below. And she says, Shank says, this was the initial sheet that I found, and then the second sheet was in the file folder. Oh, okay, so here she's saying the initial sheet she found is perhaps the 2017 one, and the second sheet in the file folder. They were both in the file folder. This is the one I found in the box. Huh? That doesn't even make sense, does it? Yes, it's the initial sheet that I found, and then the second sheet was in the file folder. They were both in the file folder. This is the one I found in the box. Okay, so Dina says, okay, the first one is the one you found in the box, and she says yes. And then Dina says, then you went to the folder and both of them were there. And again, she says yes. So it sounds like there were 2 copies of the 2017 one. that was in the box, and then she went to the folder and it had that and the 2019 one. Interesting too there again. Has somebody photocopied that and printed the 2019 one and put that in a folder together for a reason? I don't know. It's so strange, right? Okay, let's go down a bit further. Okay, we've got the cross-examination now. We've got Andy here being very pleasant in his cross-examination. Andy has a nice manner about him, for sure. You can tell he's a genuine guy who definitely is a very caring person. Now we'll go through the next part and look at how Andy finds out a little bit more about this whole strange process. Okay, so we've got Andy here saying, I just have a few questions. Is it okay to call? What would you like me to call you? And Shank says, Kathy's fine. Right, so Andy, we'll just get through the small talk. He says, you have no idea if the information on exhibit, the third page, I should say, of exhibit 228, which is the fish sheet, you have no idea if the information on there is accurate, do you? And Shank says, I wasn't there, no. And he says, you don't know if the person that reported here said, I was on the bridge from 12:30 to 1:30 or off of the bridge. You don't have any. And Shank says, I wasn't privy to that conversation, no. And Andy then says, and in fact, there could be a mistake there. Would you agree it's possible? And Shank says, anything. We then have an objection. We've got Andy saying there was a mistake made in this case related to the Richard Whiteman, correct? That's not, well, you don't know who that is. There's no Richard Whiteman, correct? And Shank says, I don't know. I don't know that there's not a Richard Whiteman, that wasn't the proper name, that. And Andy says, okay. And I was trying to figure out who made that mistake. Was that you or was it the other person, the person that drafted that report? Do you know? And Kathy says, I don't know. It wasn't me. I just wrote what was on the report. Andy says, so somebody made a mistake on Dan Doolan's report. Is that correct? I'm trying to understand. And Shank says, I believe the initial entry from what I read, which would be the first one that says cleared on it, not the second page, but the second page, not the third. Remember, the first page is a manila folder. The second page she's referring to is the 2017 one that says cleared on it. She says that initial entry was made Richard Allen Whiteman. And so Andy says, you don't know who did that? Shank says, no, I wasn't there then. It didn't come until March the 1st. And Andy says, you don't know if the police entered that, if somebody else entered it, you just don't know. And we've got another objection here. Andy says, you said you were an organizer. Is that correct? And Shank says, hope to be, yes. He says, details matter to you. Shank says, most generally, yes. So we kind of just go through here where Andy's trying to kind of get at how accurate she is. Let's go down a little bit further. So Andy then says, line 15 up to here, just the jury understands, because it's got some stuff in here that they might not know about, like Orion. That's on the third page, or on the third page, kind of in that there's a thing that says Orion right here, if you see that. And she says, yes. And basically what transpires is that Orion is the database that she was using. So we're going to skip that part there, go a bit further forward. So Andy says, okay. So I just want to be clear because I'm a little confused and I'm not, and I just want to be unconfused. Okay. So when there was a point in time where you were putting tips into Orion, and Kathy says, yes, sir. And Baldwin says, but is that different than narrative reports? And Kathy Shank says, yes, sir. And Andy Baldwin says, okay, can you describe the difference between tips and narrative reports? So Kathy Shank says, well, sir, tips are when we would receive there was an AWLG tip line, and tips would come in through email. We did not have phone tips. They were coming in through email, and I was privy to receiving those on my work email. And as I would receive those, I would enter those into the database. Andy says, I see, all right, and so that's tips. And Shank says, that's tips. Andy says, the other one was narrative. What's narrative? Now, Kathy Shank says, I called them narrative summaries. Some people might call them reports. Narrative summaries work better for my lingo with the database. When a report was completed by an officer, when they had talked with someone of interest, written a report, then that was given to me to enter into a certain section of the database called covered leads. And I would literally type that in and enter it into there, and there it would be saved. And I believe that was what was done prior to me with the narrative in there. Yes. So she didn't do the narrative in there, right? Okay, so just going down a bit further, I'm skipping just a few lines here and there where they're not super relevant. So we've got Baldwin saying, and is the narrative report section in Orion? And she says, yes, sir. And he says, and the tips is also in Orion. She says, yes, sir. And he says, you did both. She says, yes, sir. And then Andy says, all right. And on page 3 of 228, that is not a tip, it sounds like to me. That is more of a narrative report. Is that correct? So again, page 3 is the page in question for us, the one that was printed by Kathy Shank in 2019. So Kathy Shank says the bottom part is yes, the top part was considered a tip that was entered to generate a lead, which would generate the narrative report. That was kind of the hierarchy of that, if that helps you understand. Baldwin says kind of the combo of the two a little bit. And Shank says that's the hierarchy. It would be a tip entered, and then if the tip was deemed to be made a lead, that would be generated in the database, and then the lead would be assigned not by me, but it would be assigned, and then that would be followed up by talking with a person of interest where the tip had come in. And then they would make a report, or as I called it, a narrative summary. And then I would receive that and I would enter that into the database. So Andy says, okay, you're doing a great job of explaining. Do you know which came first, or did they come at the same time? Page 2, where it says lead cleared, or page 3, where the narrative report is at the bottom. And Shank says, I really couldn't tell you that. It was put in the file. That's all I can tell you. Interesting, because we can tell you which one was printed first, and probably also which one came first, because one seems to be the initial tip and the second one is the narrative. So I do think that's kind of clear. Andy says, okay, you did lots and lots, hundreds and thousands of tips, correct? And there was, to your knowledge, no other tip, if that is even called a tip, concerning Richard Allen. And she says, correct. Okay, let's go down a bit more. So Andy's just talking about what piqued her interest was a girl that had seen a guy on the trail. She said, yes, a girl that had seen a man on the trail on February 13th, 2017 at the approximate same place and time. Richard Allen had self-reported he'd been on the trails from 1:30 to 3:30. And Andy said, do you know? Oh, I'm sorry. Do you know do you remember if that tip described the guy as tall and muscular? And Kathy Shank said, at that time, I did not peruse that part of it. I just saw time, place, date, and that's why I correlated those two. I wasn't looking because the initial self-report of Mr. Allen didn't have any description of him, so that was not my concern at the time. And Andy says, so you wouldn't have known if it was that person was with 3 other girls or... And Shank says, I didn't. It just seemed to be because same place and time, same date. He had self-reported. They had said it was between those hours. I thought, well, maybe it's something we need to look at. And that's how it happened. Interesting here, right? Because she's saying it was just one girl who'd said she saw someone. And Andy's pointing out, did she know that there were more than one girl in that group? Were there 3 girls? And I think here again, we can see this narrative is inconsistent, right? So Andy says, now on page 2, his phone number, Mr. Rick Allen Whiteman, is shown in the middle section, correct? And she says, I think so. He says a little bit above the middle section, 612 something or other. And she says, let's see here. Yes, I see it right there. Richard Allen Whiteman with a phone number. Yes, sir, I see it. And Andy said, even the name, though the name was wrong, the phone number, well, you don't know if it was right. And she says, I was just putting names on files at the time. So that's all she was doing, putting names on files, not printing things out, right? And Andy says, gotcha. He doesn't actually say it in that way. I gotcha in that way. He says, gotcha. You said on direct examination, there were lots of police that at the beginning and then kind of whittled down over time. And she says, yes, sir. Okay, we can skip through this a little bit. Of course, all of the usual law enforcement are then mentioned here. Just want to see if there's anything else relevant down here. So the issue here is that we can hear the defence sort of questioning the organisational capacity, how she would have linked the tip with the girl's statement, given she didn't have all the information on that. Yeah, they're kind of drilling into some of that stuff, but we're not hearing anything about the dates being drilled into. Yeah, I can't see anything else here now, guys. I'm just looking through if there's anything else here that's relevant to how she found the tip. Okay, so let's look at Dina again. So Dina now on the redirect is saying, now you've described that there became a time when you were receiving tips by email and entering them into a database, which has now been established as Orion, and she says correct. And Dina says, did you do that from the very beginning? And she says, no. She says, was it years later or months later after March 1st, 2017 that you started to do that? And she says, I didn't begin entering tips until we had moved to the city building, which I think we'd been at the REMC possibly a year or so. I'd love to know the date, guys. If anyone knows that, let's figure that out. So there were a lot. She says, so I don't have the direct date, but it was when we moved to the city building. And Dina says there were lots of tips processed before you have any access or knowledge of tips that you entered. And she says, oh, absolutely, yes, many. And Dina says, and you did not go back and read all of those, did you? She says, oh, no. And Dina says, if there are people identified that might be talked to from a roadblock, did that information get given to you to enter into the tip line? She said, no, I think those had already been entered by someone else. She said, it's difficult to remember. That's been a long time ago, and I entered so many. I might have. If there had been a narrative summary, I might have added to that in the narrative summary, but I may not have entered it as a tip. I honestly can't recall that for sure. Okay. Then we've got recross. There's nothing. There's nothing. Sorry, the dog is barking. Someone's at the door. We'll just read the jury question. So they asked, how did you determine the name was incorrect? And she said, I determined the name was incorrect when I had gone to my file and I saw that the name written in the narrative summary was Richard Allen. And from being from this area, I knew there was a Whiteman Drive, and I believe it said Richard Allen of Whiteman Drive. And I put that together that way. We've got a question here by Miss Dina. When you were going through the box of items that you had not gotten to from earlier on, she says, when I pulled the file, and Dina says, but the reason you pulled the file, and Shank says, was because I had seen that lead going through the box. Yes, correct. And then that's it, guys. So if you look at Kathy Shank's testimony, we're hearing a lot of red flags, right? It's not matching this 2019 printout in the slightest bit. So, guys, just a summary. So in her testimony, she never explicitly claimed she printed out narrative statements or tips for the purposes of consolidating or reconciling information between tips and narratives. We did not hear that at all in that testimony. Her description of her process is that she entered narrative summaries and tips into the database. She scanned paper records. And most importantly, she started by organizing physical files and always under the direction not to read or analyze the content unless necessary for labeling or entry. She testifies to labeling files with names as written, entering tips and narrative summaries when directed, and scanning documents for digital archiving. When asked about reviewing and reconciling documents, she described beginning to scan information from each file into the database, resulting in a duplicate of her file cabinet system, but stated she was not reading the content of every folder, just scanning and entering them as part of a long-term archival process. So here we can see she was organizing paper from the boxes and then she was scanning it in. There would be no reason to print something from the system. There would be more reason to scan things in because that's what she has described as doing. This is just a summary, by the way, that I'm reading out. I have put it on the community page, so feel free to read it there. It says, nowhere does Shank say that as part of consolidating or reconciling tips and narratives, she would print hard copies or digital tips or narrative records, nor does she explain or justify printing the Richard Allen tip narrative for her own use during earlier years. And if there is a printout of the Alan Orion narrative from 2019, her testimony, as recorded, provides no direct procedural reason for this. Her stated role was digital database entry, not hard copy print consolidation for reference or filing. So if Shank were to now claim she printed the document for the purposes of reconciling or merging information, so this is just the hypothesis that I had of how they might try to explain this, but this would contradict her sworn statement, which says she had no reason to revisit that file until 2022, and she doesn't know how the document ended up in the miscellaneous box, and her insistence she did not examine tip content except at the final point of her accidental discovery. So yeah, I don't know that there is any explanation that they can come up with for this. I don't think there's any plausible deniability here. Yeah, what do you guys think? There really just doesn't seem to be a reason she would be printing that in 2019. Other than if my hypothesis is true, that this was the point at which maybe law enforcement were going back and looking at the people who were on the trails that day to rule them out of the geofence and cast analysis, or, to check their movement on that. And that would make a lot of sense. It would make sense then of her needing to go back to print the entire narrative and to get the phone details and then to write on that 2017 page 2 of the exhibit, that the information was provided to ISP, the phone information, and that there was nothing else new. That's why she was accessing it. That's why she was potentially printing it again, right? So maybe that also explains why there are duplicates here, guys, of the page. She says she found that page in the box, but then it was also in the folder. I wonder about the page she found in the box. Was that printed in 2017? Was that printed in 2019? Has there been some sort of switch there too? Because it seems like there were 2 copies of that page, and was one copy of that page photocopied or reprinted, and that was when that detail was written into it, that there was nothing new. There was no reason that they were looking at this again other than to provide the phone info to the ISP, and that was put in a folder perhaps and provided to the ISP with that information. I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. But the only reason I could think of for printing that in 2019 would be if they were following up on something in 2019, and that would marry up really well with what's written there, which says that the phone info has been sent to the ISP, and also that there was nothing new, because there was nothing new. They didn't re-interview Rick then. They didn't have any additional information on Rick then. So interesting, right, guys? Okay. Next section we're going to look at is the August hearing, and just again now linking it to the geofencing and cast information and seeing whether, again, we can provide some supporting evidence to this theory that I've had around whether the reason for the reprint or the print out of this document in 2019 was to do with phone analyses that were going on at that time. Okay, guys, we're going to pick up now in volume 6, page 247 of the transcripts. This is the August 1st hearing, pre-trial, August 1st, 2024, and we're going to look at what Miss Auger is saying. I hope I said her name correctly. Okay, so she says here, on line number 6 onwards, she says, there's also, when you're another motion in limine filed, paragraph 9 on the state's motion in limine, which is any reference to geofencing and or testimony from Kevin Horan, about geofencing or the findings from any geofence search that is not relevant or is for the purpose of confusing the issues. So there are a couple of different issues. I think traditionally, most people would say that a geofence warrant refers to a Google warrant. I don't believe that's what Mr. McClellan is speaking of here. I think he's probably because Mr. Horan is a former special agent with the FBI. He was the head of their CAST team, which is the Cellular Analysis Surveillance Team, and they review cell phone records they obtain and generally review cell phone records. Special Agent Horan did that. He generated several spreadsheets of individuals in the area. There was a map generated, and we believe it's absolutely part of the investigation and the defendants, Mr. Allen's 14th Amendment due process rights to talk about the investigation, to talk about the fact that other people or devices were present near the scene where the bodies were located. And so, as you know, in my previous videos, I have talked about geofencing and the cast analysis and phone dumps and Richard Allen's phone. And unfortunately, the defense were more arguing for this information to be available and utilized at trial to talk more about the fact that there are other people who were at the scene rather than specifically to map Rick's movements. However, obviously within that, we know that the cast report does say that Rick is not one of the 3 phones that pings near the crime scene during the key time, but I don't believe that any of the people who ping in that area during the key crime window are suspects. Nonetheless, as I've stated before, that doesn't indicate that Rick Allen is not at all on the trails that day. And the reason I say that is because people who believe Rick is guilty say, well, if he didn't have his phone on, then of course he wouldn't be showing up in the crime scene. And of course, whoever is responsible for this atrocious crime, from the sounds of it, did not have their phone available on or linked to any network during the time of the crime. But I believe because law enforcement in the state have never outright said Rick didn't have his phone at the trails that day and used that again as consciousness of guilt and premeditation, my belief has always been that Rick's phone does show him on the trails that day and leaving prior to the crime window because he's not involved. Anyway, so let's go back to what was actually being said here. So she says, and so additionally, if he, Mr. McClelland, is referencing to the return on the Google warrant, there is absolutely data in those returns that we believe are relevant, placing potential other suspects at the scene. And given that they did that as part of their investigation, I certainly feel that we should be talking about that. In particular, Your Honour, there is a device at the cemetery shortly before the murders. Now, that's not one of the 3, I believe, in the circle that we've seen as part of the cast report, but that is still another one in the vicinity of the crime area during that window. So they said, we know, or Jennifer said, we know from Detective Murphy's testimony that the general consensus was 2 to 5 or 6 people involved in this. And we believe that's the source of one of those people. And we believe that we should be allowed to speak about that. Now, I think we all agree it's highly likely that there are multiple offenders here. And I guess to coordinate multiple people, there's a high likelihood that at least one person in that area who was involved had to have had some level of phone contact with the outside world, or had some way of contacting and sort of signaling to others. It definitely seems like there was coordination here. I still can't get past the check-ins of people and timestamps of people very close to and around the timestamps of Abby and Libby's Snapchat photos, or Libby's Snapchat photos. So there was someone, I believe at least, coordinating movements. And so I would imagine that one of the phones within the broader area around that time potentially at least is linked to one of the perpetrators. So side note, let's get back on track. So Jennifer says, Your Honour, I have, unless anybody from the state has a response to that about Mr. Horan, I have one other issue I'd like to bring up. bring to the court's attention. Mr. McClelland says, you want me to go on? And the court says, sure. And McClelland says, okay, Judge, I'm not an expert in geofencing. I'm not an expert in Google warrants. This was the defense's opportunity to call witnesses to talk about those things if they wanted to. Interesting, right? He's expecting that they should have an expert when he knows that they have limited funds. Then it's not an accurate science. Well, that's interesting, McClelland, because your understanding of tool mark analysis using a method that greatly from the scientific method is an accurate science. So interesting how we cherry pick which sciences are and aren't accurate. Geofencing is indeed highly accurate and has been used significantly over, I believe, nearly the past decade in criminal cases. And in fact, geofencing particularly can really create a fairly small radius. It's not exact, but it's pretty damn good. When he later refers, and we're going to read on in a minute, to the wider radius, that is more relating to tower dumps when there are not many towers in the area. Yes, that can be kind of tricky and can make it hard to pinpoint exact locations. But geofencing in an area like Delphi, where there would have been plenty of people connecting to Wi-Fi, there'd be many opportunities to get a fairly good range. Okay, so he says, my understanding of geofencing is it's not an accurate science. I think Special Agent Horan or retired Special Agent Horan will even tell you we don't use it for probable cause because it's so inaccurate. Really? Not sure about that. Just because a data point on a map through a geofence shows that a phone was there, that's a radius within where that phone can be, and it can be anywhere from 15 meters to 25,000 meters. And so I would ask the court to grant the motion in limine. So interesting here, because he doesn't have an expert to back up these things, these testaments that he has around it. He says that even Special Agent Horan would say that. However, Special Agent Horan actually did the cost analysis and found a number of phones that pinged within what he said was a 100-yard radius of the crime scene. And that was part of his report. So clearly he does think that you can pinpoint things to at least a degree of accuracy. So McClelland continues, if during the trial the defence can present evidence that the geofencing is reliable information that the jury can consider, the court would be able to hear that and make a determination then. But right now, the knowledge that the state has is that information is unreliable. It's wholly unreliable. Yeah, maybe not as unreliable as comparing an unspent round to a fired round, but anyway, and doing that multiple times to get the answer that you want, but that's just a bit of my snark there, guys. Anyway, and it's only entered for the defense to be able to say, well, the pinpoint on this phone showed here, therefore he must be in the crime scene. Again, not an expert at geofencing. That's not my understanding. The pinpoint is the center of a circle of a radius of where the people could be or the phone could be, and that could expand. Some of those expand to include even Tippecanoe. How do you say that? Tippecanoe County. And so unless the defense can show that this is accurate enough to say the phone was in the area of the crime scene at the time of the crime, the state believes it's unreliable and believes it should be kept out, Judge. Well, if you didn't think it was reliable or useful, why did you use the resources of Special Agent Horan to complete the cost analysis in the first place? Anyway, Jennifer continues, Your Honour. First of all, Mr. McClelland's statement certainly are not evidence. Thank you, Jennifer. You're right on point there. There's some ideas about what he thinks things mean, number one. And number two, there are two different sources of data that we're discussing. And I don't know if he's referring to geofencing as all of the cellular data they gathered. But what happened first was the state went and obtained what they call tower dumps. Now, Jennifer has a much better understanding of this process from the sounds of it than McClelland. So they sent search warrants to Sprint, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, and they received data back from those companies. Some of that data is more reliable than others. Now, that's the cell tower dumps. What Kevin Horan did, and this doesn't necessarily to go the identity of one person, but it goes to the quality of the investigation. Kevin Horan is going to testify. He left a list for Unified Command to follow up with. Whether they followed up with those people and how they followed up with them is absolutely relevant and absolutely part of Mr. Allen's 14th Amendment right, due process right, to present a defence and to speak about the quality of the investigation. Whether Kevin Horan identified certain phones, he put them on the map. I don't disagree, those aren't pinpoints, but they are people in the area that should have been investigated. And so, of course, we're allowed to talk about the quality of the investigation, who they followed up with, who they cleared, and who they didn't when they knew that these people were in the area. We're not saying that they were at this specific location, neither is Mr. Horan. No one's saying that, but the issue is that they had a list of suspects that weren't properly vetted. And that's what we'll be referring to in the course of this information. So here's the issue again here. I mean, Jennifer is on point with this. However, she's still arguing largely that they need this information to investigate third parties rather than that this information, it wouldn't necessarily pinpoint one location, but it could certainly show broader movements of a phone within the area, which in Rick's case would mean it could show broadly whether he was at the trails, when he approximately left, because we would see the pings would show movement over time, and that could give us a better indication of where he was, when he left, etc. Anyway, so she continues, that's with the cell phone data, and Your Honour, it's different with the Google data. The Google data is very accurate within 3 to 5 meters. 100%, Jennifer. Anytime, if you have Google open on your iPhone, if you have an Android, anytime you pass by something that grabs your location. So by the way, I don't believe you have to have Google open on your iPhone, but you do need to have a Google account for a geofencing to grab your location, which most people would have had back in 2017 and continue to have to this day. This is why, you know, if I go to the mall in Indianapolis and I'm walking in Keystone Mall, sometimes I shop at Williams-Sonoma. I can say that, but I get ads for Williams-Sonoma. I don't know, is that funny? Is that why she's saying I shouldn't say that? I think she's trying to be a little bit quirky here, I guess, because my phone knows where I am and knows where I'm walking into that area. So also relevant here, again, just going back to that point before, Richard Allen, I believe, has always had Android phones. So this information would be able to potentially trace his phone movements that day, at least broadly. So the Google location is much more accurate than most of the cell phone tower information, 100%, because in this area there's only 2 main cell towers. But the individuals that we're referring to come from those Google returns, and those are relevant. So here's the issue again, is that the defense are really worrying more about the third parties in this motion rather than flagging the fact that Rick could actually be traced using this. And I think that's something that's been it's something that was ignored perhaps or not identified by the defense, which I think could have really helped in the case. Again, if you want to know more about geofencing and phone dumps and how that could have helped Rick, please watch the presentation that I made a few weeks ago in regards to that. So Jennifer says we can show it not only through Google data, we can also show it through video from the Hoosier Heartland or Hoosier Harvest Store. I always get that wrong. Jennifer's very conversational. I like her. She reminds me of me. She says, so not identifying certain people, but again, it goes to the nature and quality of the investigation, which is always his right to discuss at trial. Thank you. So she's really kind of asserting that they'd want to use this to show how the police didn't investigate thoroughly. Okay, so McClelland then says, I guess they're saying the statements I make is not evidence. That cuts both ways. Oh, I think he's getting a bit cranky here. But the reality is he said they had no evidence, and then he gives his evidence, and now she's saying that's not evidence, and she is more correct than him as far as my research shows. Anyway, the only thing she's told you today are her statements. She's not putting anything in evidence for the court to consider the accuracy of those things, yes, because they don't have enough resources. Okay, I just want to go down a bit further because there's a bit of other stuff here, and I really wanted to see if I can find the part where McClelland actually talks about not having the full report or something to that point. Let's have a look. Oh goodness, I'm just searching through the document, guys.
No, I don't actually think it's in this one. So it might be in one of the others. But anyway, I mean, that gives you a little bit of a snapshot. If I find the other point, I will add it on after.
Okay, guys, I was pretty sure that there was more mention of the Geofence stuff in the pretrial hearings. So this is actually the hearing held on, I believe, July 30th. So I'm just going to read this small part here as well, because I think it's relevant to our discussion. This is Jennifer Ojay again talking about the geofencing. So this is 2 days prior to the testimony that I just went through, or the transcript I just went through. So she says, so this is 2 days prior to the transcript that we just discussed. And she says, so for instance, we have a drive of e-discovery. There are 48,701 files. Over 600 of those files are labeled by numbers. Actually, let's keep going. Okay, so Jen's talking about the discovery and how massive it is and what's missing or what's hard to kind of decipher. And she says, for instance, one of the things we believe that we do not have is what I would refer to as round 2 of Google warrants. For reference, guys, this is volume 4, page 103. She says, I don't know how familiar the court is. I don't want to speak down, but the way Google warrants work is there's a warrant issued to Google, and we want all of the devices in this geographical area during this timestamp. That generates a lot of data. In fact, in this case, round 1 came back with over 18,000 lines of devices, times, and locations. And so for privacy purposes, what Google does is when it responds, instead of putting names, it responds with device IDs. And so there are 18,000 lines of device IDs, times, locations. And the spirit of it is, and even the warrant that was sent to Google says, hey, we would like to ask for more data without an additional warrant listing up this. And so generally what happens is you go back and you say to Google, we would like the subscriber information for these devices and narrow down. You don't ask, obviously, for all 18,000 lines of data. When I asked Mr. McClelland about that, he referred to me to an FBI Geofence report. And I think there's a lot of data. So just one point there. So this is what I've referred to again in the Geofence presentation. So stage 1 just gives you anonymous data, and it's basically the 18,000 lines are pings. They might be from not 18,000 devices. They're from the number of devices in that Geofence, but the reason there are multiple lines is because it pings every few minutes, I believe, or sometimes more frequently. So basically what she's saying here is they've got the anonymized data. They don't have the follow-up, which they would have needed in order to identify subscribers within that geofence. And there's no doubt that law enforcement would have that. They'd have to have that to do what she's referring to here, which is the cast report, but they'd also would have had not just the cast report, but the data that they used to match it all up and make the cast report, I suppose, or develop that report. So just continuing on, it was done by the US Marshal Service, so I don't think the FBI actually did the warrant. I don't think the FBI did either. That's just me, guys. And Trooper Vito prepared a report. So a half hour later, we were able to find the report, supplement number 118. On Friday, September the 25th, 2020, I received an email containing the Google Geofence information from the FBI. Again, I think that's a mistake because we don't have any geofence information from the FBI, and he attached the FBI geofence analysis to his report. What we have are 6 spreadsheets of data that I believe are the original. He also, Mr. McClelland said, FBI agent Sabrick reviewed this data. So let's just go back. So half an hour later, we were able to find the report supplement. On Friday, September the 20th, I received an email containing. So this seems to be what's written, because you can see it's quotation marks. Let's continue. I don't know how many hours I've spent doing name searches, looking for documents, looking for FBI agent Sabrick. I believe that they have this information, and it's not for lack of effort. It's not that we say, oh, I wonder where this is, I'll email Nick. We spend considerable time diving through these numbered documents over all these different drives. So I don't want to sound as if we're whining, and maybe it sounds a little bit like that, but I think I have a solution. I hope that might help everyone in the course of this. And so she continues a little bit further. And let's go down. I think it's when McClelland responds to this that it gets interesting. So I'm going to go down, and we've got here just bear with me, guys. Might need to just do a search. Give me a second. No. Okay. Maybe that's all. But I guess what we're seeing here is that we don't have still, the defense do not have the information that they require, right? And that's a problem. I'm just trying to find. Okay, guys, my recording is all over the place today. I'm finding I'm chopping and changing because I'm doing it between other activities. But just going back to this July 30th, 2024 transcript, I found the other section where they talk about the geofence. And so I'm going to, oh, there we go. I have to complain about that, but it's fixed itself. I believe. Just going back to what Jennifer Roger is saying about the issues with the geofencing information and what has and hasn't been included. So she says here, this is in volume 4, page 117. She says, Your Honour, the one thing that I do believe that we're missing is, again, round 2 of the Google return. Mr. McClelland stated on May the 3rd, the information about the Google warrants that I believe you're referring to is in regards to the Google search warrant under cause number. And he gives me the cause number. There were 5 different warrants there is a corresponding file to that warrant in your discovery information, which is accurate. You got that information last hearing again on January 30th. You got the search warrant return in the raw data. And then he said Special Agent Michael Sabrick took the raw data and put it into a report. We have no reports from Sabrick. Andy and Brad searched everywhere. So basically she's saying that McClelland has responded to them saying that they have a report from Special Agent Michael Sabrick, but they have searched and they cannot find this report. So this report is included in the FBI reports. But again, that's what McClelland, I believe, has told them. But Jennifer is saying again, I can't find it in the FBI reports. She's got, again, quotation marks. You got those reports last year. Further, ISP Dave Vito used the information that Sabrick gathered and used it in his report. So again, that's supposedly McClelland's words to the defense. Jennifer says that's the supplement 118 I read to you earlier, that where he says he has attachments, but we can't find the attachments. So if we could just please have that round 2 of the Google return that identifies the device IDs, the names. Okay. Interesting, right? So clearly this is now just a couple of months prior to trial that they don't have it. And I just want to see if McClelland has a response to this, but you can kind of just see from that there is this sense that the defense are looking for this information, and McClelland keeps saying, you've got it, and you've got this, and you've got that, and they're not able to find it. Now, I mean, that could be that they're just not able to find it, but I kind of doubt that. It just feels a bit fishy. So let's go down. So McClelland's now talking about Detective Vito. So he said he's done a little bit of looking around over the lunch period and talking with Detective Vito and was able to find some documentation to submit to the court. He's moving to admit it. I'll have a look at those exhibits in a minute and see if it's anything of what we've discussed today, as in the geofence cast information. I doubt it. So let's just see what McClellan's saying here. He says supplemental report from Detective Vito that Jennifer referred to. If you look at the second page, it's a screenshot of the attachment to Supplement 118. Supplement 118, if you look at the attachment, it has number 118. And then the third page is the first page of that attachment. And that is, the state believes, that is what Miss Auger is looking for when she referred to the second round of Google returns. He says the second document is a discovery receipt and it's signed January the 30th. So let's have a look, actually. Let's look. I'm going to pause and I'm going to see if I can find what that exhibit is. Okay, guys, I did a bit of digging. I could not find what this actually is, Supplement 118. So, yeah, I have no idea what they're talking about. So I just feel like it seems as though they're making it appear as though the defense have just not done a good enough search. Like they're saying, they're kind of referring back to Estates Exhibit 3, the discovery. I'm just gonna have a look as we're talking, because it just feels like they are blaming it on the defense not having looked carefully enough or found things. That's how it's appearing, but let's have a look. I'm just going to see what States Exhibit 3. I think these exhibits are different. That's the problem, isn't it? They're different from the official trial exhibits because this isn't trial. So I'm just going to go back through again and see if I can figure this out. It's exhausting. I mean, goodness knows what it must be like for the defense having to go through and try and find all of this. Ridiculous, right? Okay, so let's go exhibits, this motion, and some of them are like A's and B's and some of them are numbers. Is that because they're defense versus state? I think that might be, but okay, wait a minute, guys. Let's see. What's exhibit 3? Yeah, so what they're doing, this is exhibit 3. Okay, here we go. They're referring them back to this. So they're saying, see, we provided you with everything. I feel like that's what Nick McClelland is saying here. Let's go back again to the testimony. Sorry, guys, I'm working this out as I go along with you guys rather than having pre-prepared this part. So let's go back. So he's saying States Exhibit 2 is a supplemental report. Okay, wait a second. Let's see what States Exhibit 2. I looked at States Exhibit 3. Oh, wow. Goodness, guys. I've got so many exhibits open now. Let's go. So States Exhibit 2. Okay. Oh, interesting. States Exhibit 2 is excluded from public access per rules on access to court records. I mean, that may be because if it is anything to do with geofence information, then it would be potentially containing information about people who were not on trial. Maybe that's why, I don't know, trying to be generous here. But I mean, regardless, it's 3 pages. 3 pages is not really a sufficient amount of material based on what probably would be contained as part of the casts and geofence analysis. I doubt that they would only have 3 pages worth, but yeah, maybe they do. Hard to know. Okay, so just going back though to this issue around the geofence information and the cast information, it's clear that there was caginess about this. You know, if we go further in the testimony as well, so I'm going to bring that back on my screen again. It's still up on your screen. It definitely just seems like, yeah, here we go. Actually, just going back here, it says, and so just an example, Judge, for the court to consider that oftentimes they do have these things, but they're just not able to locate them. Okay. So there's kind of this jab at the defense that they do have all of this stuff. They're just not able to locate them. But I think the defense are basically saying here, no, we don't have the stuff that we actually need here. So I believe that, is there anything else that comes up? So we've already looked at that. just doing a bit of a search to see if there's anything else that I've missed around this Geofence information, and Agent Fabric, who just does not seem to be showing up anywhere. Yeah, I don't really see anything else here. So yeah, I guess overall, what we see if we look at these hearings from July 30 and August 1 of 2024 is that it seems as though the defense does not have the full data. It feels like the prosecution are saying, we don't know what you're talking about. This is all we have. And it seems incredibly limited. And it seems like the prosecution really do not want this information included. They are kind of saying, well, this is much less accurate than it really is. They're basically quoting massive big ranges of error for geofencing, which I don't believe are accurate. They may be accurate for the tower dumps, but not for the geofencing. They're saying it's confusing people. And so they ultimately are able to have this information suppressed at trial. And we know already that's a big deal. But in light of what we're talking about here, which is the lost tip, my suggestion is that that information in full, geofencing information in full, is potentially exculpatory. I do actually believe it is exculpatory for Rick Allen. I haven't seen it, so big, bold claim to make. And I believe that either that is buried in discovery or it has not been provided. If it is buried in discovery, that means that there's opportunity still for the legal team to have a look at it. If it's not, then there's still an opportunity to contact Google and request information about what Unified Command or law enforcement, I suppose, in general, the prosecution in general did request in terms of geofence information for this case. And obviously we can't request that, guys, but certainly the defense team or the legal team for Rick Allen should be able to potentially access that. And yeah. Now, when I raised that in the previous presentation around geofencing, that was before we learned about this 2019 printing of Rick Allen's narrative. And back then, I thought this may end up being a PCR issue. I mean, I'm sure that the appellate counsel will talk about the fact that so much information was suppressed and how unfair that is. But, you know, further digging for information and checking and things like that may have had to have been PCR. But now if we're actually saying that we've got this very unusual instance of printing in 2019, and we actually have a narrative, a testimony that does not add up with the facts, I wonder if there's anything more urgently that can be done. So anyway, I've sent all of this information off to, well, not all of this, but I've sent information to Andy Baldwin, and today I also did send an email to Stacey Uliana, and I hope that one of them or both of them will see this as a massive issue, because I think it really is. It's massive that if testimony that was presented at trial does not add up with the facts, that's it's a big issue. Yeah, anyway, I've tried to compile lots of information here today. It's quite a lot. It's pretty long. When I play this for you guys as a live later today, we can chat and clarify things because I've done it piecemeal. I'm not sure if it all sort of flows, but again, I've been told not to be so self-critical, but I do set the bar high to try and organize information because that's what my brain needs if I'm listening to information, to have it kind of in some sort of process and order. But I hope that makes sense why I presented this again. This is actually probably more detailed looks at some of this transcript in relation to the geofencing. I didn't go into as much detail in the geofencing presentation about this aspect, which was what was discussed at the hearings. Anyway, guys, I will turn over to you guys for any questions or comments, and I will be live with you and we'll chat. Okay, guys, anything final we want to add? That was pretty long, so
I've probably kept you guys long enough. But yeah, I guess really big issues here. There's a whole series now in terms of this lost tip information that I've done over the last few days. So if you haven't watched some of the previous ones, obviously feel free to go back and have a look, because you'll probably see the sort of progression of information. Each video covers a slightly different angle. So I hope they're not too reductive, I suppose. But I think that there are so many aspects to this lost tip narrative that are important, and hopefully it will make a difference. I really urge everybody out there who believes in Richard Allen to send this information to people you think may listen. I mean, if anybody else has had any correspondence with Andy or with any of the legal team, please flag it too, because I've sent lots of emails, and I think obviously when you send a lot of emails, maybe you get a bit kind of they get a bit oversaturated, and so I don't know how much of the information I send is getting through to the lawyers. I have had responses from some lawyers, and but yeah, I just not about this issue, guys, just in the past. And so I'm hopeful that they'll pay attention to this issue too. But yeah, please, guys, if any of you feel like you may be able to reach out to one of Rick's legal team or anyone you know connected to Rick to really flag this issue, please do so. The more we get this out there in the public light, the better. Thank you, everybody, for watching today. Really appreciate you all. You're amazing. It's so nice to have so much support and so many like-minded people. I appreciate each and every one of you that comes by and chats with me, likes and subscribes, and even the people who lurk as well. I really appreciate you guys too. I know obviously when you're lurking, you may be doing other things or you may not feel confident to come into the chat, but please know there is never going to be anyone who's going to be harsh or nasty to you in the chat here. We have some wonderful mods making sure of that. And yeah, we're here to be a supportive community and a kind community. So never fear engaging with me, even if you disagree as well. Just reading the chat, Jake Brooks, welcome. How much geofencing was done on Tuesday morning? I'm not sure. I mean, that's the thing. We just don't have any information. I believe the tower dumps were done over the course of a few days, but I'm not 100% sure, so don't quote me on that. I think there's a lot more information that we're just not aware of. Understandably, we're not aware of it all, but I wonder how much of that information was also buried or completely suppressed from the defense team as well. Just feels like there were red herrings thrown in there and diversion tactics. And so some of the really important stuff just never really saw the light of day. And that is so disappointing, because there's an innocent man sitting in jail suffering because of it. So I know some of you are probably going to log off soon. I'm just going to put up the website again. I haven't done a formal presentation, like a written presentation for this one yet, because there was a lot of evolving information over the days, but hopefully within the next week, I will do a written presentation too and pop it up on the website so that people can go back and have a look at that if they don't have time for hours and hours of lives that I've been doing over the last week. Let's pull it up as well, though. Oh, here we go. I don't know if there'll be many more lives this week. I think I've probably done justice to this lost tip narrative, but who knows? Maybe I'll hop on a bit later in the week and see if anyone is interested in having a chat. And yeah, absolutely happy to keep talking about it all. I do have part 2 of the psych panel too to edit and put up. So if anyone's interested in hearing not just my perspective, but 2 other psychologists who have no real background knowledge of the case, talking and giving their opinion about some of the stuff that we've heard about Rick in the testimony. Hopefully Diana will join me again for part 2 as well, so we'll try and tee up a time so you'll get 2 psychs who know the case really well, me and Diana, and 2 psychs who are pretty blind to the case, talking about the psychological testimony for Rick. And yeah, I guess that's probably all for today, but just have a quick look at the website before I go. Just quickly checking the chat. Erin saying, haven't checked that, Jake, with the group of 4 geocaches were definitely very active then, even if partly divided later. Okay, perfect. I reckon there's definitely more information. Thank you so much, Erin, for telling us a little bit about geofencing and stuff. So yeah, if you ever want to come on and have a chat with me and explain it to people, I hope I've done it justice. My knowledge of geofencing was learnt through ChatGPT and Google and a few YouTube videos, so certainly not at all on the level that you would know. So if you are interested in coming and chatting, and that applies to anyone. If anyone wants to come and have a chat, I will probably do a live that just sends the StreamYard link. And if anyone wants to come and talk to me or talk about things they know, please feel free to. You can also email me if you want to do anything formally as well. Diana says 4 likes for the price of 1. Wait, is it 4? Oh yeah, that's right. Your audition's better than mine, Diana. I was gonna be like 5. No, I'm one of the 3, of course. Yes, Diana, you're gonna join us again for sure. You're joining us in every part of the psych series. Okay, let's put the website on the screen, and I'm going to show you my little video that I feel very proud of that introduces the website.
The Richard Allen Justice Project was created to bring clarity to one of the most complex and troubling cases in recent history. Thousands of pages of testimony, legal filings, and technical reports can feel really overwhelming. But we've broken them down into clear presentations and videos, using research, psychology, context, and critical analysis to help make sense of the raw documents so you can see the bigger picture for yourself. We implore you to explore the evidence, understand the flaws, and join the call for truth and justice.
Yeah, so here's the website. I'm still adding to it at the moment. It's still pretty bland. I do want to do some videos around who is Rick Allen and the flawed case. And sorry, you can hear my dog again scratching in the background. I'd like to make it a bit more personalized, so I'm going to keep working on that. But we also have here the 2 most important things to click on here. Obviously, if you're already on YouTube, you know about my YouTube, but the presentations. So this just actually is the Canva presentations that show up like this, and you can kind of just work through them yourself. If you want the explanation and the rabbit holes, then come back to YouTube and search. Each one of these has at least 1 video that is attached to them. Some have multiple. And as I said, I will add some more presentations to the site. So we will add some more about the lost tip that will come up over the next week or so. The psychology of Richard Allen, that should be ready soon. I have the report, and I should probably just link the report rather than try and make a presentation, because there's a lot of work to do with just making those slides, because I'm a perfectionist. So I might just do that. But yeah, just keep checking back. I'll keep updating it. Thank you guys again. A few of you've stuck around right till the end, and I super appreciate that. I super appreciate the people who keep coming back, and love seeing all of your faces and all of your pets' faces too, because I love the little avatars that everybody has. Maybe I should change my avatar to Daisy's actual picture. But you guys have all seen Daisy in the intro. That is who my channel is dedicated to, my beautiful pup, who is now unfortunately in heaven, but is my inspiration for sure. Okay, guys. Well, good night. It is 10 o'clock here, and it's time for me to get some rest. But definitely comment below if there's any thoughts or ideas. And yeah, email me and reach out. And please spread the word, guys. Take care. Bye.